Good morning. I'm Mark Katz, professor of government and politics at George Mason University, and pleased to be the moderator for this second session. And we have two speakers, the first of whom is my very old friend, Dr. Theodore Karasik, whom I first met, as I recall, in 1991 in November at what was then the American Association of Slavic Studies annual meeting. And we'll never forget that one of the leading Sovietologists of the day told us all in a general session that actually Gorbachev was still in control. He was just about to, to pull the plug on Yeltsin and all his opponents. Haven't heard much from him since then. But I have heard from Ted Karasik, and he's had a long and distinguished career and working on Russia in the Middle East, often in the Middle East. He's currently at Gulf State Analytics here in Washington, and you'll see him all over town. Next speaker is Rauf Mammadov from Azerbaijan, who's worked with the Azeri State Oil Company. Currently, he is a senior fellow for energy policy at the very prestigious Middle East Institute. Today's panel, this panel is on energy gambits and the Qatar crisis, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. We talked last time about how Stephen Blank talked about how Russia likes to exploit conflicts, and it certainly does. And I think, though, that this, like everyone else, this conflict between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt on the one hand, and Qatar on the other, it's a strange one that Russia genuinely wants to be on good terms with both sides, because in fact there's a lot of money involved, and the Russians have become rather dependent upon that. But why don't we start with Ted Karasik, who will speak for about 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much to the Jamestown Foundation for making this possible. I want to take the next 10 minutes to talk about what I see as Russia's financial tactics in the region, but how it's also related to the Qatar crisis, all in 10 minutes. But the main point here that main points here are that Russian tactics, at least financial in the region, have been ongoing since about 2007. And this has been a developing policy by the Russian state to get more involved financially within the Gulf states and throughout the wider Middle East region. I call this a north-south corridor of development between Moscow and the Gulf states. And this concept of north-south corridor has been picked up by the Gulf states, particularly the lower Gulf states, and they use it in their policy-making documents and so on in terms of developing this north-south relationship closer. Throughout the past decade or so, we have seen the creation of all kinds of different vehicles, if you will, that help promote financial ties between Russia and the Middle East states. And I just want to draw your attention to a comment that I made in my paper from last year that I now have pinned on my Twitter. This is not advertisement for Twitter, of course, but the point is the following, that Russia's moral vision involving spiritual sovereignty, great natural wealth in strategic minerals and energy, plus Moscow's relationship with China and the rest of the Far East appeals to Arab authorities and businessmen. And that is occurring right now. That appeal of what Russia represents as a future leader of this Eurasian space, that's of a north-south corridor, is something that Arab businessmen are very interested in, Arab policymakers are very interested in, as well as how that interties with the triangulation between Moscow, China, and the lower Gulf states. Having said that, the tools or the vehicles that you see interacting between Russia and the Middle East states take a couple of different forms. The first, of course, are state-owned companies, particularly those that are involved in, let's say, port construction like DP World. We're seeing DP World from UAE getting more involved in projects in the Caspian, projects in Vladivostok. The ability for these types of state-owned companies that are involved in logistics to work with Russia is growing. Russia, on the other hand, is using its sovereign wealth fund, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, to make deals with other sovereign wealth funds, which is another type of financial vehicle, to make deals with those sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf states. Now, there's been a lot of talk about sovereign wealth funds and their activities between Russia and the Gulf states. But let's face facts here first and foremost. Every sovereign wealth fund is different. It's like a thumbprint. They're all structured differently. They all have different types of goals and ways in which they want to make revenue and where they see investments in emerging markets and so on. But the point here is with the sovereign wealth fund development between the Gulf and Russia and vice versa is the political cost, if you will, or the political revenue that you receive from these types of investments. And the Qatar crisis accelerated the development and speed of these sovereign wealth funds between Russia and the Gulf states and how they interact in terms of political favors. I can go off on this later, but the best example, of course, is the Qatari Investment Authority and its investment in Russia and how that has paid off in terms of potential political favors in the rest of the region and particularly in Syria. This is a game that is ongoing now. Besides the SWIFTs and the state-owned companies, you have other SWIFTs throughout the region that are beginning to stand up. We just had the creation of the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Where is the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund going to get its startup capital from, given Egypt's poor economy? You might want to ask the folks in Abu Dhabi about where that money will come from. The point being is that Egypt, as an emerging sovereign wealth fund type state, its first real client is going to be what can they do with Russia. So it's within this sovereign wealth fund arena that they're able to do business. Now, as part of this short presentation here, there's an impact for the United States, clearly. And that impact on the United States has to deal with the fact that our Gulf allies are doing business with Russian companies that are under sanction, whether it's under this SWIFT format or whether it's under the state company vehicle format. So we need to ask ourselves a major question of whether sanctions should be put forward, or the notion of sanctions put forward against Gulf allies or Arab allies who are doing business with Russian entities such as Rosoboron Export, who have offices in the region itself. Should those offices continue to function in the region if we are trying to achieve particular goals in the Middle East and particularly in the Gulf and particularly with the Qatar crisis and trying to resolve that? Or does it go to bigger issues such as what's happening with Jerusalem and the future of Iran? This is all intermixed together in terms of monies. I'd like to also say here that the implication of what Russia is doing to avoid sanctions is important here in the Gulf context, because what Russia has done is set up the Russian Export Center in the Middle East, and particularly in the Gulf, to function as an intermediary between Gulf states and Rosoboron Export, so the clients in the Gulf can receive their goodies without having to deal with a sanctions situation. So Russia is very cleverly setting up new entities in order to stay ahead of the sanctions race This phenomenon needs to be watched very closely. And who is in charge of this Russian Export Center project is Fradkov's son. So I think for some of you that will make the picture more complete. Finally, I'd like to say here that currency and the printing of currency continues to be a tactic used by Russia to gain hearts and minds in the region. Under Min Fin in Moscow is Goznak, Goznak. Goznak is a premier currency printer. The Russians print this currency not only for themselves, but for other states around the world. And in particular, the Russians in the region have printed currency for Syria, Yemen, and Libya. The presence of this currency is a type of soft power, and it is an occurrence that we need to recognize more and more as Russia begins to print currency in MENA war zones, but as Russia begins to use the Gulf as what I call a lily pad, in a sense, to get deeper into Africa, which we'll talk later today. So this idea of printing currency is a signal of the depth of Russia within other parts of the region and other continents. Overall, this whole area of finance between Russia and the Gulf, MENA, and then on to Africa represents a gigantic gray zone in our understanding. This research here, I feel, has provided a means in which to look at these issues through both quantitative and qualitative methods, and to look for remedies that can be used to help the U.S. government make policy in the near term. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Rauf.
Yeah, I'll be. Can everyone hear me? All right. First of all, thank you, Jamestown, for having me in this team since the beginning of the project. I'll be glad to share my research with the audience. Well, the speakers have already mentioned the narrative of Russians, the perpetuating notion that the world has to be multipolar, and Russia has to be one pole of it. Energy diplomacy plays an important role in that overall overarching strategy. Russia is heavily dependent on export of unfinished goods. Almost half of its export revenues come from energy, and almost 36% of budget revenues come from energy. And therefore, it's in the best interest of Russia to promote the multipolar world, and at the same time to become a player that will influence the processes that happening in the energy world. The Gulf region, in this regard, becomes a perfect objective for the energy diplomacy of Russia. First of all, almost half of the world oil and gas reserves located there. Gulf and bigger Middle East region, all the main important navigation routes go through there. And we have seen from the recent examples that was mentioned here, the Bab el-Mandab Strait and Hormuz Straits are located in the region, which together almost 30% of the oil and gas go through these straits. Another reason why Gulf is important, because Russian companies were subject to sanctions from the U.S. and the West, the Europe, and therefore it needed to find new sources of funding for its activities and for geopolitical aspirations as well. And Gulf seemed like a perfect target for that. And another reason Russia looked into and tapped into the Gulf was actually to find new markets to sell their gas. It might sound ironic, but the demand growth for the gas in the Middle East is substantial. And for instance, Russia's trying to woo in Saudi Arabia to buy its LNG from Arctic, whereas Qatar is next door and using that the conflict between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, again using that tactic of divide and rule, they're trying to supply more gas. Actually, the energy minister of Saudi Arabia attended the commencement ceremony for the Arctic LNG, and where Putin told him directly, buy our gas so you can sell more oil, because Saudi Arabia is burning oil for most part of its electricity. Another reason why Russia is interested in Gulf was actually to work with the Gulf countries, who are the major exporters. Two of the largest oil and gas exporters are located there, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to work with them together to stabilize the oil prices and then to achieve the increase in the oil prices. And there have been, these states have been petrostates, both Russia. I mean, Russia is not a petrostate, but it has the elements of it. But the Gulf countries has been there forever. Why was Russia successful in tapping into the market, in building these relations? I think the first, there is a regional reasons for this, and there's also macroeconomic processes that happened simultaneously at the same time. First of all, the chaos that was created after the vacuum that was created after the Arab Spring, and United States didn't interfere to the region that much, and following the military conflicts in the region has created a vacuum, and Russia felt that it's the right time to interfere and to become a player in the region. But the more important processes happened, and these two processes actually eased Russia's way into the Gulf. The first was the oil prices plummeted in 2015, and but what's interesting, it happened at the same time when the U.S. and the West applied sanctions to Russia. As Russia is constantly in the state of, Russian leadership is constantly in a state of paranoia, being encroached, and they were hinting that United States was behind of the price plummeting. I mean, directly by intelligence offices or anything. So they understood that if they don't make a deal with Gulf states or major exporters, the prices will go even further down, and it will. What happened to Soviet in 80s will happen to the current regime as well. So that kind of paranoia drove them closer to Gulf. But what made is their way into the Gulf was that the power vacuum created by non-interventionist strategy of the United States, and that these are the factors that facilitated their entrance to the market, and what they have achieved. One of the biggest successes that they have achieved was the stabilization of the oil prices through this Russia-OPEC deal, which seemed, for energy experts, seemed incredible. I mean, no one expected that to happen, because first of all, there are members of the OPEC are there are some members of the OPEC are in constant, permanent confrontation, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're arch nemesis to each other, and no one expected them to go along and to come up with a solution or with a deal. Well, Russia managed to play as an interlocutor between these two powers and actually convince Iran. Russia was very instrumental to convince Iran to have the deal. Now we have the deal for almost 2 years, and it has been, actually we have 3 separate deals, because every time these countries come together, it's a weird group of petrostates that are driven by the notion that we have to stabilize these prices, because if we don't, these regimes or these countries will basically fail. But at the same time, they are conflicting each other. There's Qatar, who is conflicting with Saudi Arabia. There's Iran and Saudi Arabia, and there are also many other interests as well. But Russia's role was mediation role in this, played an important role to bring these countries together and achieve this stabilization. As a result, the oil prices have increased from $44. Average $44 in 2016 to now we are in mid 70s. And just to put it in perspective, in 2017, the average prices were around $64, and according to Russian energy minister, Russia has gained additional $36 billion for that $10 price increase. Just to put in a context, their overall exports were equal to mineral exports were $200 billion. And just another example, according to Russian opposition, Russia has spent so far almost $3 billion in Syria. So you can see how much the stabilization of the prices contributed to their budget, and strengthened them to implement their strategy in the region. The other, actually, the most important objective that they have achieved was signing bilateral deals with, as Ted mentioned, with the Qatar Investment Authority, with Mubadala, the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund, and many other, and Saudi Aramco's deals, multi-billion deals in Russia, which which happened mainly as a result of first ever reigning visits of Saudi Arabian king to Russia, and as well as the Qatari emir to Russia. Overall, this cooperation is very nascent and is very vulnerable, but so far Russia has been successful in achieving those objectives that they put in front of them. And in terms of the OPEC, in terms of that ROPEC deal that we have now, OPEC Plus deal, however you want to call it, I see the prospects of the deal less and less. I'm less optimistic about it, because we have almost 2.5 million barrels of non-OPEC oil, mainly from United States and North America, coming to the market. And as more oil comes especially from non-OPEC countries, come to the market, the relations, the cohesiveness of the cartel becomes strained, and it will have more pressure on it when it's kind of an ambiguous deal. No one knows what the caps are, who regulates these caps. The countries taking advantage of the situation in Venezuela, in Libya, in Nigeria, or actually in Canada, where there were disruptions in the oil supply, increase their caps as much as they're possible, and reap the benefits. But overall, the United States has to be very careful by monitoring this relation especially between Saudi Arabia and Russia, because as we remember, this year, Saudi Arabian Crown Prince, factual leader of the ruler of the Saudi Arabia, actually made a statement in visiting the United States, saying that they are eager to institutionalize relations with Russia for 10 or 15 years. Now, we don't know what's going on between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Are they really planning or making any practical steps to institutionalize these relations? But the anticipation of it can already has to raise eyebrows in Washington, D.C., because Russia's overall tactic has always been to create interdependencies with Europe, with any state that are allies to the United States, and then use that interdependence to undermine United States positions or West positions in the world. So therefore, it will be important to create these channels with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to prevent any de-escalation, any planned or any unplanned escalation that could happen in the Middle East, because it could be disruptive for markets. At the same time, to try to resolve the crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, because Russia is clearly using this as their divide and rule tactic to pull these countries out of the orbit of the United States, and most importantly, to supply more oil and gas to the markets from the United States, to facilitate that process, because more liquidity in the market will contribute to free market forces and will decrease, as I mentioned before, the impact of cartels such as OPEC or gas exporting firms to oil and gas prices.
Great, thank you very much. Now I'm going to use the privilege of the chair to ask the first questions. Don't you hate it when people do that, moderators say that? I do, but only when I'm sitting there, not when I'm sitting here. so I'll go ahead. So, Rauf, in particular, there's a couple of things that you mentioned. You talked about Putin encouraging the Saudis to buy Russian LNG. I guess my question here is, why don't the Saudis simply buy their own gas? They have an awful lot of it. Is this simply a question of something happening, temporarily, or is it sort of like a demonstration sale, such as when I think that there have been some Russian-American deals that have been kind of demonstration sales more than harbingers of things to come. Is this, are the Saudis really going to buy Russian LNG, or can they just plain develop their own? And secondly, what I wanted, you talked about this Russian role with regard to mediating between OPEC partners. Now, of course, OPEC has had this problem long before this cooperation has begun with Russia, so I think they must have other mechanisms. But I guess my question to you is, has the Saudi-Russian cooperation on oil prices essentially replaced OPEC? And I guess the analogy that I'd like to think of is that, back in the 1950s, when the U.S. Or Texas controlled the oil market, it was the Texas Railroad Commission that set prices. Louisiana and Oklahoma automatically set the same prices, and hence the cartel was enforced. Now, are we seeing something similar? Saudi Arabia and Russia set the price, and then the rest of OPEC more or less has to take it, the way that Louisiana and Oklahoma did back then. So those are my questions for you.
Let me start with the second one. I think yes, Saudi Arabia and Russia are the leaders of the cartel, and they dictate the conditions. Although in the first deal, Russia played as an intermediary between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Actually, in the last deal, which happened in June, Saudi Arabia energy minister and Iranian energy minister Zanganeh sat and negotiated it between themselves. But overall, I think yes, Saudi Arabia and Russia are the dominant in the OPEC, which actually diminishes the importance of the cartel itself. It becomes more idle, I think, or redundant. But yes, they do the dictating. But then the question arises, why would Iranians agree with the Saudi Arabians? Because they don't have any other option. They want the prices to be more than $65, $70. They, especially given the upcoming sanctions, and it's there in the best interest as well. But what we've seen right after the deal, when Trump tweeted and then started pressuring Saudi Arabia, and and there was a response from Saudi Arabia that they are ready to cooperate with the United States to supply more oil to the market. It makes the deal seem redundant, because there was an agreement that was made on June 22nd, and then a couple of days later, United States interferes, and Saudi Arabia agrees to break the deal. So these facts are showing that OPEC is becoming less and less important. But the fact is that for the last 2 years, and probably for the first half of 2019, this deal is in place. It's a very vague and it's very abstract mechanism that they're using to regulate it by joint mechanisms, commissions that they have within the OPEC, as OPEC within the OPEC. It's basically that entity or that institution is controlled by Saudi Arabia itself, Saudi Arabia and Russia. And they call the shots in that joint mechanism commission that they have, which regulates the caps, and although there were no caps. So yeah, to that point, I think OPEC is becoming less and less important. As far as Saudi Arabia's gas imports from Russia concerns, first of all, it was just a proposition. It was just a proposal. It was a political statement made by Putin. There was no response to it by Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia has this aggressive state program called Vision 2030, which claims to decrease the dependence on oil powered power generations, and it makes sense for them to developing any gas field takes more than 7 to 8 years, especially the gas deep water gas fields. By the time they launch the program and develop the field and they start producing, it will take probably 10 years or less than that. if they need that substitute gas, they can sign a shorter term agreements with Russia. But having said that, UAE is another major producer of oil, and we know that wherever the oil is produced, there's always gas. It comes together. Actually, gas is used to produce oil, or vice versa. UAE imported gas from United States, and there has been talks actually between United States Energy Secretary, who visited Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to sign these long-term deals. And we've heard that the deal between Europe, the trade war between Europe and United States, there was a LNG item in it. We don't know what exactly that was, or will it be effective, but it shows certainly that Saudi Arabia is interested in importing the gas, and there are options such as United States or Russia, and I think that's where we're going now.
Right. Maybe they're just flirting. I don't know. Ted, I wanted to ask you this: this conflict, this Qatar crisis. To what extent is it an opportunity or a problem for Russia? I want to specifically talk about how I think it was a few weeks ago. What we saw was that, last year, the Saudis indicated that they're willing to buy the S-400 air defense missile system from Russia. Then more recently, we learned that Qatar is interested in buying this, and of course, Russia is interested in selling both. And the Saudi response was furious that if Qatar did this, they were going to take a moat or something around Qatar. They were going to take all kinds of that. They were Qatar was going to suffer if Qatar bought S-400s. But there was no threat made to Russia, and the Russians sort of indicated that they were going to sell to whomever they wanted to. I'm just interested, in other words, that if this Russian-Qatari deal goes through, how does this affect Saudi-Russian relations? Because unlike, as Steve was talking about last time, Iran, which doesn't really have much choice beyond Russia, Saudi Arabia does. And it strikes me that if in fact we do see an arms relationship develop between Russia and Qatar that the Saudis and the UAE object to, that in fact this is going to just push them more towards the United States. But I'd like to hear what you think about this.
Thank you, Mark, very much for your question. Later this afternoon, we're going to have another panel. No, there's still room here. That will talk more specifically about the S-400 issue. However, you've brought up some very interesting points within the question, which is really about the Qatar crisis and whether it presents an opportunity or a problem for Russia. I think Steve said it earlier today that the Qatar crisis provides an opportunity for Russia because of the way Moscow can play multiple sides on the issue. And they have seen this crisis, if you will, from that particular perspective. When you start looking at how Qatar has behaved with Putin, for example, with the Emir going to Moscow to meet with Putin and so on, versus the visits of the King of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, or even the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, you see all these leaders going to Putin to pay some kind of homage to him, because Putin is seen by these Arab leaders as the referee for the future of the region. And in this respect, they see, for them, Putin represents a certain amount of wasta, if you will, that he has this power. Having said that, when it comes to weapon systems and sales, but on the sales side, and also in other financial areas of interplay that surround the Qatar crisis, is how much of this money that we're hearing about is just optics, or is it real money moving back and forth? We see all kinds of agreements being signed in the wake of the Qatar crisis of when it erupted last year, of deals that are going back and forth between Russia and these countries. They are MOIs and MOUs. but with really no money switching hands. So we need to look at the metrics of this money and really what's changing hands and what's in the public realm for purchases of weapon systems or so on, versus those that fall maybe in a gray zone that does not pick up those transactions that can occur from the subsidiaries of these sovereign wealth funds or state funds that go to Moscow, that pay for other goodies that go to other countries in the region. One example that I always give is how UAE, because of even before the Qatar crisis, but now because of the Qatar crisis, in this gray zone, a subsidiary of one of the sovereign wealth funds in the UAE gives money to Ros Oberon Export for weapon distribution in the region, particularly to Egypt. This is one of those payoffs. This is a metric that can be used, but it's gray. So there needs to be a greater exploration in this area to tally it up. This is my answer to you, excluding.
Very good. Okay, the floor now really is open for questions. And when I call upon you, I hope that, unlike me, you will be brief in your questions, that wait for the mic and then identify yourself as well. So who do we have? Steve. Yeah.
This question's for both Ted and Rauf. You know, we've heard a lot in the last few days about whether or not Russia's got a $50 billion energy deal with Iran going. My question to you is how real is it? Because Moscow said no, and after Iran said there was a deal, there are already deals on the table or in practice. So is there a $50 billion deal with Iran in the works for Russia? And does China play a role in that?
Well, yeah, there were numbers ranging from $25 billion Russian sources, potential deals, to $50 billion statement made by Zanganeh and Rouhani. The facts are stubborn things. The only contract, upstream or oil and gas contract, signed with between Russian Zarubezhneft and Iranian national oil company was $500 million enhanced oil recovery project. This is not even a greenfield, what we call, start from zero, scratch, and then and develop the field. It's an enhanced oil recovery. Besides that, there has been MOUs and MOIs between Gazprom to build a pipeline to connect to Pakistan and India. There has been other MOUs signed between the parties, but we don't see any. I haven't noticed any actual development projects going on in terms of the oil and gas development. Having said that, there is a chance that they could participate in Azerbaijan field, the gas field, which Total left. Russian companies have been flirting with the idea, but Russia doesn't have that $50 billion living that they have set aside, and they can invest in such important projects. They have, those kind of money. Even $5 billion is very important for Russian economy at the moment. So I think these numbers are just exaggerated and used for political purposes, as Mr. Professor Katz mentioned. It's just flirting.
The way that I look at the announcement of this deal and its optics, it's more optic heavy, if anything, as part of the emerging horse race in the region, if you will, for the redistribution of sources and connections. And as we see, as we heard in the first panel about what's happening on the ground in Syria between these three different powers, again, this triangulation, if you will, is occurring between Russia, Iran, and the Gulf itself, but over the future of Iran and where it's going to sit as the Gulf states and the Trump administration push harder to make sure that the old order in Iran begins to evaporate. This is part of that horse race right now, in my opinion, and you can see how this division is being driven by the cleavage that was formed in the wake of the Qatar crisis in terms of new economic outreach by Qatar has shifted around the geoeconomics of the region. I think Russia's deal here with Iran is part of where Qatar sits in the future. But we'll have to see how that unfolds in the coming weeks and months because of this discussion about setting up MISA, not the Middle East Studies Association, but Arab NATO, which is an old idea and is being resurrected again. This is also part of the restructuring of the security architecture in the region today. I hope that answers your question.
If I could just add my 2 kopecks worth, this occasion in which the Iranians announced that there was going to be a big Russian deal, and the Russians sort of indicating that not necessarily so. This isn't the first time this has happened. In fact, it's happened several times in the past. Iranians have announced a deal with Russia. The Russians have said actually there isn't a deal, and the Iranians don't seem terribly embarrassed about it. It's quite interesting. They just do it routinely. Gentleman right here.
Michael Ryan from Jamestown. Ted Karasik, you mentioned the Egyptian sovereign fund, and you mentioned the source. But what does Egypt want to achieve with this sovereign fund?
Thank you very much for your question. The Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which I mentioned is relatively new and being stood up now, is meant to duplicate a lot of the activity of its Gulf brothers, if you will. And this is what we've been seeing in Egypt for the past few years, particularly after Morsi was kicked out, is that the Gulf model of development, economic development, and so on, was used as a template, if you will, to be moved over to Cairo. And we saw a lot of deals that were being signed for the for constructing the new Cairo, if you will, and the entry of Emaar, which is a UAE real estate company, to build New Cairo as a new capital, much like Astana versus, thank you, that there would be this new capital. And the Egypt Sovereign Wealth Fund represents this new Egypt in terms of the way that Egypt could be able to portray itself as a sovereign country with a sovereign wealth fund in which it could invest for the future. The problem with Egyptian projects naturally is they take a very long time to get off the ground. And because of corruption within the system, the likelihood of the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund operating like many of the other wealth funds may get off to a very bad start. Another part of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, too, in theory, is to be able to work with Egypt's emerging gas industry, if you will, or the further growth of that industry, particularly with the Zohr field. I think that this is all tied together, and in that sense, the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is to be bringing in revenues related to the sale of the gas and so on, will help build for a better future for Egypt and its citizens. But the problem is it's got to get off the ground first. It has to be extremely transparent in its activity these days because of the focus on transparency in many of these other organizations and how they spend their money. Thank you.
Next question, please. A little nearsighted, so if you could hold your hand up. Right there on the left.
Thank you all for your analysis. It's very interesting and Candice Rondeau, Senior Fellow with New America Center on the Future of War. This question is actually for Mr. Karasik. Actually, I wanted to see if you could unpack a little bit more the suggestion or the insight that you had around the effectiveness of the sanctions so far, U.S. sanctions on Russia, and the strategy that many Russians, individual and corporate, have adapted in terms of seeking out workarounds not only in the Gulf but elsewhere. Obviously, it's tempting always to talk about the Russian state as a monolith, or any state as a monolith. But clearly, we have to understand that the state-owned industries have their own individual leaders and interests. And I wonder if you could sort of unpack some of those individual interests, how they might play out domestically in Moscow, as well as how that sort of pertains to relationships between particular state-owned corporations like Rosport Export, Sovcomflot, and others in the region.
For the next hour, I'll be giving you a lecture on this.
I will add.
And he will add another hour. No, thank you very much for your question. This is it's an excellent question that you've asked. As someone who lived in the UAE for 10 years, and I saw a lot of sanctions busting by many different countries, I can assure you that there's been a trajectory of lessons learned by countries like Russia and Iran about how to evade sanctions. And this is much like something we're going to talk about later today, is the evolution of air defense. There's an evolution in all of these capabilities to escape what the West is trying to impose or put or achieve. In terms of the Russian and Iranian sanction busting, if you will, I think it's important to recognize how both countries use what I would call 5th or 6th degrees of separation of know your customer, or KYC. It is within these networks that these two countries and the corporate or entities that go out and try to set up companies, but they use them as fronts. And these fronts usually are 5th or 6th degrees of separation of individual. Iranian front companies in the UAE or in the Gulf that are fronts for IRGC or MOIS are usually done by Indian nationals because they're the easiest to recruit for this type of front. The Russians, on the other hand, have a slightly different system for this. They don't actually try to hide it, they just do it. And so when it goes back to your question about sanctions busting and so on and groups within Russia, I would have to argue that those that are tied clearly to the energy industry are the ones that profit the most. It's the peoples like Sechin, it's the people like Patrushev, who is constantly to the region looking at these types of issues in terms of security and what needs to be done to achieve Russia's national strategy goals in the region itself. Another person that I mention is Fradkov. Both father and son are deeply involved. And that right there gives you an indicator of who in Moscow, when it comes to sanctions and sanctions busting, may be at an advantage here. These are all Siloviki who run this op. And it is within that context that they know best how to bust sanctions. So I see them as being the ones that succeed in sanctions busting in Moscow. But what's more fascinating is what Gulf allies, if you will, of Moscow see in that sanction busting and how they can benefit from that or not as they try to achieve their political goals throughout the region. I hope that last point was clear. Thank you.
About the monolithic nature of Russian system, as far as the energy concerns, first of all, one of the largest companies in Russia is not subject to sanction, which is Gazprom. It cannot be sanctions basically because it supplies almost 40% of Europe's gas. But there is a struggle between Gazprom's head Alexander Miller and Igor Sechin on acquiring on breaking the monopoly of Gazprom to export gas from Russia. And Sechin has been, who's Silovik, as Ted mentioned, has been pushing hard for quite a long time. And I think one of the successes that he has gained was that Putin has been using Rosneft as a main vehicle for its energy diplomacy in Middle East, or especially in the Gulf. All the deals that have been made, it's either Rosneft or Rosneft affiliate companies, but there are some other minor companies that have been involved as well. And this has been, Putin understand that there is a confrontation, but as long as it doesn't go against the national strategy or the strategic goals of Russia, he keeps them contained within that competition. It's like controlled competition between these two large companies in order not to have any negative impact on their success.
You meant it.
I just want to, there's another financial factor, if you will, or commodity that we really need to start paying attention to. This might come out more in the PMC discussion, but there's a real move by both Russia and the Middle East, obviously, and I mentioned a moment ago about strategic minerals. This strategic mineral drive right now by Russia and the Gulf states is something that brings them together into cooperation. And this is why it's so important to pay attention to where these groups are coordinating their future strategies in terms of markets, emerging markets, and so on. The targeting of Africa, which we will talk about later, is part of this. And I think it's important to remember that both Moscow and the Gulf states and some of the North African states are working in concert together to leapfrog further into Africa, and that strategic mineral angle comes into play, and we could probably bring in North Korea too, but we'll leave that for another briefing.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, yes, please, ma'am. Just wait for that mic, please.
Hello, my name is Shri Danatal, and it's sort of a question, sort of a comment, but in Egypt, the relationship between Moscow and Egypt right now, they're going to be building a nuclear power plant, possibly in 2 years, and they cracked the deal 85-15 for Russia's providing the financing for this. And meanwhile, China's also made a deal with Egypt for their power grid. So it's sort of this energy diplomacy, like you're saying. And then on the other side of the Arabian Sea, we have, of course, Saudi Arabia. And Russia is already sending oil through Israel to Iliad, Ashkelon. And that's been ongoing for a while. So their diplomacy in these different areas, I always see it as above the fray of politics. It's like oil and gas, one set of rules, politics another. So I was wondering if you could comment to that.
As far as Rosatom concerns, I didn't mention it. Rosatom is the state-owned nuclear company of Russia. It controls almost 40% of the market right now, and it has been very active in building relations with the Gulf states. For instance, the KEPCO, the Korean company, is building nuclear power generation in UAE, but Rosatom has already signed a contract to supply fuel to UAE. And Rosatom is also in the short list of companies which are involved in the bidding for the Saudi Arabian power generation. So as in the energy case, Putin has consolidated all the power in the energy, in military exports, everything, and now he's using them as a tool to implement its goals. And the same goes for Egypt as well. Rosneft is a shareholder in Zohr field, as Ted mentioned. By the way, they just sold the percentage of their share. ENI sold percentage of their share to Mubadala. Mm-hmm. So there's a cooperation going on between Russia and the Gulf states, and whatever Russian interests do not conflict with the the Gulf interest in other parts of the world, especially in North Africa, they cooperate. And but wherever they don't enter or they don't see it as a feasible to enter, like Algerian market or Moroccan market, they stay aside. But they're very active in Libya, they're very active in Egypt. So it's a overall, the same tactic they've been deploying in every part of the world by using consolidated power, by using the state-owned companies to implement.
Okay, one question that I have, and don't even expect an answer, is that, I think that this is such an interesting question, this question of Russia's energy relationships and economic relationships more broadly with the Gulf states, clearly one that deserves a lot more research. But to what extent are we seeing is Russia essentially the one that's in control or is deriving advantages, or is in fact are we seeing Gulf actors do with Russia what they've done here and elsewhere, and that is enmesh their partners in a set of economic relationships that bind those partners to the Gulf. In other words, that if the Gulf feared Russia's involvement with Iran, they've now created not just national level incentives, but personal incentives for an awful lot of important Russians to take Gulf interests into account. And it strikes me that this is something that Gulf diplomacy has, economic policy has done very successfully. Well, we have reached 12:30 and we do need to keep a schedule. So I'd like to close this panel now and thank our speakers very, very much.